Peter White talks to medalists and visitors who've been at the Paralympics, including one former Home Secretary, and he'll be asking why blind spectators aren't being offered audio description. That's in 40 minutes. First on BBC Radio 4, Eddie Mair celebrates the SOS Message service, which ran on the BBC, on BBC Radio, for more than 70 years.
The corridors in this building, Broadcasting House in central London, may echo to the sound of the BBC's finest hours and half-hours. Those wartime transmissions that are part of the collective national memory. The great broadcasters who became our friends. All the comedy, news, drama and music that's core to those BBC principles. But these corridors also echo to the sound of things like this.
Will Robert David Green, believed to be working in Manchester or Stockport, go at once to Bonchurch Road, Milton, Portsmouth, where his mother, Mrs. Agnes May Green, is dangerously ill. That's the end of the SOS message and of the news.
If, like me, you remember hearing those carefully worded pleas, you too will have wondered about the human drama behind them. Did the intended recipient hear the message? Did they ever make it to the bedside of their ailing loved one? And now we come to think of it, whatever happened to those messages? I can't remember when I last heard one. In this programme, we'll hear about the Reithian origins of the SOS message, about how they made it onto the airwaves, and from some of the people for whom the messages were not just a few words before the news, they were deeply personal.
Somebody obviously heard the SOS, which didn't reach me, obviously, and that's why they were so useful, wasn't it?
It came too late in my case, but I'm sure there are a lot of people who got these messages and got home in time, saved them a lot of heartache later on.
I've often thought since, if we hadn't have had the message, if we hadn't have heard it, if that lady hadn't have heard, we would perhaps not have been able to see my grandmother at the end. We would have been left without closure, as they say nowadays.
The first transmitted SOS message by the British Broadcasting Company was in March 1923. The Birmingham station sent out an appeal to help find a missing boy. There was a happy ending. As to the originator of the SOS service, well, come with me into the Council Chamber here at Broadcasting House, one of the most important rooms in the building, and you don't normally get in. It's all wood panelling, giant semicircular room, a lot of meetings going on in here, some of them important, but the room is dominated by a giant portrait of John Reith. He was the BBC's first general manager, later director general, and as he looks down at us, I can't tell from his expression whether he's scowling at what we're doing now or encouraging us to do our best work in the tradition that he started.
He was the inventor of public service radio, and he could quite easily be persuaded that that was a public service, a service to the public.
Ian McIntyre, former controller of Radio 4 in the 70s and the biographer of John Reith. What do you think it says about Reith's BBC that SOS messages were part of the remit?
Yes, well, that is, I think, another manifestation of the extraordinary stamp that he put on the place. It takes its place alongside things like the weather forecast, the shipping forecast. Certainly his thoughts always were for public service.
And already, even in these early days, the procedures that were required, Camberwell Police asking the BBC to broadcast an appeal, and the procedures began to be set in train, although there is here the story of an SOS for a pelican that escaped from the lake in St James's Park, so I think they tightened up the rules on what was allowed.
One thing one can be sure about, and that is that Reith made his views known about the procedures, because, I mean, he knew everything and did most things in those days. So he would have known all about this. They've never written the rules.
Reith, always with this quite out of proportion sense of how magnificent and important and valuable and important to the nation the BBC is going to be, is hunting around, actually, to relate to government in some ways. And I think he's, in a way, hunting around for a purpose.
Jean Seaton, you're Professor of Media History at the University of Westminster. You're also charged with the ongoing task of chronicling the BBC's history. And here I have copies of a letter from John Reith to the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police.
Yes, saying, I'm interested to see a newspaper report yesterday in which reference was made to the use of wireless in connection with your operations.
There are possibilities in wireless which would be of great interest to you, and I should be glad to come in and have a short talk with you on the subject.
But he also says, would you like to come and give a talk? So what he's doing is thinking his way through how the BBC might be useful, but also making a connection with somebody in London who might be useful.
And Reith was quick off the mark. I mean, the first SOS message was in March of 1923, and here he is. This correspondence is concluded by the 14th of June with the Commissioner of Metropolitan Police saying, yes, I'll come over, I'll bring my engineer. So within weeks.
I mean, but that's Reith. Reith's got this image in his head, this Presbyterian image of what communication for virtue might be. So policemen and the Home Office, these are all people he wants to get on with.
Will Harry Singer, a musician, last heard of 2 years ago in Rupert Street, London, and Mrs. Bella Turner, last heard of 2 years ago in Derby, go to the Mildmay Mission Hospital, Austin Street, Bethnal Green, London, East 2, where their father, Goodman Singer, is dangerously ill. That is the end of the SOS message and of the news.
By the 1930s, the SOS message service was part of BBC Radio's sound furniture, along with its public service twin, the shipping forecast. Now we tend to think of SOS messages being about people who are dangerously ill. But the range of the messages, before and after the war, quite something. In 1937, for example, there was an urgent appeal for a wet nurse for twins born in a hospital in Norfolk. In 1952, an unsuspecting bird lover who'd bought 2 parrots in a Birmingham pet shop needed to be traced because the shop manager had subsequently died from what was believed to be psittacosis or parrot fever.
The BBC, you see, by broadcasting some, everybody had started to think that the BBC would be a very good place. So some lady phones up and says, you can imagine, did I leave my hat on the tube? And so the BBC needs to stem the flow, but in a proper way. This is all about stabilising. But it's also, in my view, about Reith and the BBC saying we're not just about entertainment. If we're going to do anything, we'll do it properly, and we have to talk to the proper authorities. And he's terribly keen to talk to the proper authorities. So this is by 1931, and what it starts to do is research. And what they do is they try and work out whether the SOS actually works. So appeals for witnesses produce 10 witnesses come forward, but 50 appeals don't produce any witnesses. Missing persons, you get about 45 out of 190 are successful. Most are unsuccessful. An illness, it's near a half are successful in that case. So what they're doing is working out, actually, appealing for illnesses is quite successful, appealing for witnesses jolly unsuccessful. So really you shouldn't do it. So that it's evidence-based policy making.
And it must have driven the decision to stop doing the appeals for missing persons. Which
absolutely. It's evidence-based. Unlike, governments in the 21st century, it doesn't work, so we won't do it.
Here is a police message about an accident at Hendon last Sunday evening. There was an accident at Watford Way near the junction of Greyhound Hill, Hendon, London at 20 minutes past 8 last Sunday evening when an elderly woman was fatally injured by a motor car. Will any person who saw the accident or can give information please communicate with New Scotland Yard, telephone number Whitehall 1212. That is the end of the police message and of the 10 o'clock news.
But how did this plea across the airwaves come about? What was the process? What rules governed such a petition? I'm on my way to the present-day BBC Radio control room. Ian Wink? which is everything you think it might be, littered with loads of computer screens, television inputs, and people very busy keeping all sorts of networks on the air. And who better to ask than Harriet Cass, senior announcer on Radio 4, who started her BBC career back in her time, 1974, wasn't it, to be candid? Can you remember?
It's earlier than that.
Oh. Well, I'm sorry I made a point of it now. Now, in your time, you'll have read many SOS messages. Can you shed some light on how they made it onto the air?
Yes, what used to happen is that somebody would ring up the BBC. It would then be passed on to the newsroom. And the person who dealt with it in the newsroom was the shift leader typist. We used to have typists. And the shift leader of the typists would take on the responsibility for checking the SOS messages. There were very stringent checks that had to be made. The person who was being sought had to have lost contact with the family. There had to have been no other means of getting in touch with them. The person who was ill, that had to be confirmed by a doctor. They had to be dangerously ill, which in fact meant that they were probably dying. The shift leader who made these checks would ring up and talk to the doctor in chose. When all the checks had been done, then she would type up the actual message on an orange piece of paper.
Well, look, I've got an old form here. Does that ring any bells?
Yes, that certainly does. That is the form that the shift leader typist would have gone through. It was a very strange piece of broadcasting because it's the only time that the BBC would ever be broadcasting just to one person. We never repeated it. We never repeated a telephone number or the name or the hospital or any of the details. It was just once and once only. I can only remember, I think, 2 occasions where somebody rang up and said, "Thank you very much." They got there in time. And the rest of the time we never knew.
Oddly, I think one of the things the SOS did, it was implied that actually the nation would bring broadcasting to a halt for an individual in peril. So I think it had an import that probably the BBC wasn't entirely in control of, although those rules show you how careful they are of the reality of it. It gave an impression of Britain as a interconnected village.
Some of these documents reveal an entirely different era. They speak to times long forgotten, approaches we no longer have. This is something from the 1931 BBC yearbook, How the SOS Service Works. This is the Bible of the SOS Service. It's pretty rich, isn't it?
I actually found this terribly moving, and it speaks to a different attitude towards the individual and privacy. For most listeners who are not directly concerned, the broadcast SOS message contains a strong dramatic element, and suggestions have been made that the detailed results of such messages should be made public through the microphone each week, i.e., was it successful? The BBC cannot, however, regard the messages in the same light. They are, in general, the urgent private affairs of people who, in the last resort, are forced to make their anxieties public. It is true that in many cases the messages finally reach the addressees in strange circumstances, and that the details of the trouble taken by the complete strangers to pass on these messages to the proper quarter would be valuable evidence for a royal commission on the inherent kindliness of human nature. But they are hardly suitable for broadcasting as entertainment.
One of the most common things people have been telling me about the SOS messages, they always wonder what happened next.
Absolutely.
But here's the BBC right from the start saying, no.
Absolutely. No.
And that's never changed. Never changed.
Never changed. This is not a matter of prurient entertainment, either for you as the listener. It wouldn't be good for you, actually. But in particular, we have to be careful and attendant to the fact that these are extraordinary moments in people's lives, by definition.
However, as a result of a speculative inquiry in my column in Radio Times last year, when I asked for readers' memories of SOS, I was privileged to receive, in many cases decades after the event, the testimonies of people willing to share their experiences with me, and now for the first time, with you.
My name is Keith Farley, and my SOS message concerned my father and my brother. I was on holiday with my wife and 2 young children in Tenby on a fortnight's holiday, and my father had lost his wife, as my mother, obviously, had died 3 months earlier, and it was a bit of a low ebb, and we tried to get him to come on holiday with us, but he wouldn't. Then at the last minute, he decided he would just come down for a few days. The day he decided to come down, my brother suffered a serious heart attack. They rushed him into intensive care, tried to get hold of my father, but couldn't find him. The next morning, they still hadn't found him, and they put one of his SOS messages over the radio. We didn't hear it because we were off on the beach somewhere, enjoying the sun. So the first we heard about the SOS message was 6 o'clock the following night. Someone had left a note on the caravan door. But unfortunately, in the meantime, my brother had passed away. So the message was semi-successful. Someone did hear it and gave us our whereabouts, but unfortunately it was too late.
Keith's father never forgave himself for going on that holiday. Londoner June Gibson also contacted me. She was raised by her maternal grandparents, but in 1952, at the age of 11, she was on holiday with her mum, when the landlady of the guest house in which they were staying had an SOS message stating that June's grandmother had been taken dangerously ill whilst travelling home from America on the Queen Mary. The message was relayed in time for June and her family to meet the ship at Southampton.
It was one of those bright days where everything is steel grey and is sort of over bright. And normally it would have been thrilling, but it had overtones of awfulness because we didn't know quite what to expect. And Nana was brought off.
And was she on a stretcher and a wheelchair?
She was on a stretcher, and I remember the cries of the dockers and everyone chucking empty milk cans down their gangway next to it. Anything not wanted, from the voyage was coming down. It was as though my grandmother was amongst the rubbish, if you know what I mean. I couldn't really believe it. It still haunts me now that I couldn't do anything. I seem to be paralysed almost.
And between that day at the port, when your grandmother came off the Queen Mary, and her death in Hampstead, how long did that take?
Well, it was about a week. She was so ill, more than you'd imagined, from the port visit. So we had a chance to say goodbye, really, you see, through that message reaching us.
Are you grateful to the SOS message system?
Oh, indeed I am, yes. I think, really, we would have been totally... When I say we, I think the general population would have been very much the poorer without those messages, because we were cut off. Hardly anyone had phones, and I've often thought since, if we hadn't have had the message, if we hadn't have heard it, if that lady hadn't have heard, we would perhaps not have been able to see my grandmother at the end. We would have been left without closure, as they say nowadays.
The words contained in the SOS messages were never sensational or dramatic. Quite the opposite. Some clinical facts, names, car registrations, caravan descriptions and phone numbers. But the messages hinted at life-changing moments for people we'd never met. Terry Locke, your SOS message was broadcast in 1957. What happened?
Well, I was on a school camp. It was the end of my first term of teaching, and we went off on this trip, and it was on the dot. So nobody quite knew where we were. This was the point, you see. So anyway, then the police arrived, and they told me that my mother had had an accident. And I said, well, what sort of an accident? And they said, well, she's fallen in front of a train.
Can you remember your feelings on hearing the news?
Oh, yes, I was horrified, firstly. Well, I'd no idea at that stage that she'd tried to commit suicide, you see. And I sat on the train wondering whether she'd got one leg or one arm or what sort of state she'd be in when I got there. And when we got to Tooting Hospital, I found Mum sitting up in bed, looking very crestfallen, I suppose. I'd been away, my brother was in Spain, so she was all on her own, you see. So she'd obviously thought it out, and she'd gone down to the local tube station, Collier's Wood, it's called. I can't ever go through that station now without a shudder.
Well, I'm not surprised.
And it was only when I spoke to her that I realised what she'd done.
Did she tell you?
She did. And that was it, really.
What were your feelings towards her at that moment?
Well, the first feeling was relief that she wasn't dead, and then, to be honest, anger. Why had she done this? I mean, I really did think about the poor driver, you know, I wonder, and still do to these days. Did he ever drive again? But she told me she'd done it on purpose.
Did she tell you why?
She wanted to die. I mean, it was one of 5 attempts she made, and on the 5th attempt she got it right. I loved her. She was my mum, of course I did, but very sad.
It might be hard to recall, but before your own experience with the SOS message, your direct experience, did you remember hearing them at all? Did you have any knowledge of them?
Not really.
And subsequently, when you heard, I mean, when I heard SOS messages, it always piqued my interest, and I wondered about the person who was ill. I wondered about the people who were being called out to. Would they make it on time? Had they heard the message? Would they make it?
Yes.
What were your thoughts when you
Exactly that. Yes. Exactly the same. Somebody obviously heard the SOS, which didn't reach me, obviously. You know, having been there and having been so impressed by the kindness of the police. They were so good, and that's why they were so useful, wasn't it?
Those 3 witnesses are but a sepia snapshot of numerous stories emanating from the SOS service, so single-mindedly forged by Reith in the early days of the BBC. But the impact of the messages and their abrupt repercussions created a kind of unspoken collective soliloquy in the lives of ordinary people through their stark encounter with the random, unforeseen.
And now, here is an SOS message for... It doesn't matter who. It doesn't matter where. Where his father is dangerously ill. I remember the last abortive call, unanswered. The phone ringing and ringing. The panic drive with every red light, every learner on the road, and me not knowing there was really no hurry now, though guessing it. Forbidding it, in my gasping, no, no. The half-closed eyes, the half-smile, and the cold of him, the terrible cold. And then the ache of guilt for not being there, for missed moments of opportunity, all the usual, ordinary, everyday griefs, really, contained by implication between one programme and the next. Somewhere a clinical light in a pool of darkness. A flickering machine. The mechanics of dying. Around the so-still struggling form. The business of hospitals, peopled by people who yet have a purpose. And somewhere else. Out there the distant kin. Remote. Always walking in a rainy street. Perhaps hearing, perhaps not, the radio's calm, red announcement, concealing the desperation of a last resort. Find him. Find him. Here is an SOS message.
Because of this impact on people's lives, as highlighted in that poem written by Sean Street, the BBC ensured that they continue to diligently manage the effectiveness of the service. But what about the people who were themselves the subjects of the broadcasts, afflicted and desperately in need of family comfort? In 1958, Linda Miller, as a 6-year-old and staying with her aunt, was rushed into hospital in Sunderland with the potentially fatal disease osteomyelitis. Her parents were on holiday in London. They didn't hear the SOS message, but a vigilant listener had, and recognised the car number plate.
Apparently, they were parked outside of some hotel, and a man on a bicycle knocked on the car window and said, "Are you Mr. and Mrs. Miller?" And they said yes, and they said, "Well, there's been an SOS on the radio. Your daughter's seriously ill in hospital." And then they started this apparently horrific journey back up to Sunderland because it was thick fog, and they had to drive all the way back up to see me.
That's a fantastic story about the cyclist.
Oh, yeah. And apparently he kept in touch for a while. I've got a letter when he'd written to the hospital asking how I was doing.
How long did it take your parents to get to your bedside?
I think they were there the early hours of the next day.
And can you remember them?
No, not arriving. I apparently had the last rites, so, it was touch and go, I think.
They must have been worried sick. What did they tell you afterwards about it?
Don't really remember. I think probably they kept the trauma away from me. It was only as I was older and I found the press cuttings and things that I realised what had happened.
Well, I've got one in front of me from the London Daily Sketch, Saturday, August the 30th, 1958. The headline, SOS, Where is Mother? And there's a huge picture of you looking gorgeous. The parents of a 6-year-old dancing girl were being sought all over Britain last night.
That's right.
Oh, the drama.
I know. It must have been really traumatic for everybody concerned, but I think me, as a little girl, because I was getting better, it just all sort of washed over me. I wasn't aware that all of this was going on. But it's nice for you to have a happy ending to your stories.
Well, I know. Fantastic.
And I did dance again.
Well.
So it all happened very nicely.
One of the things that's particularly struck me is the crucial part played by the observant passer-by, the keen listening landlady, and a certain Mr. Clampett, who took the trouble to track down Linda Miller's parents. The SOS messages inspired a sense of community spirit, a pulling together in adversity. And whilst over the years, though wars and rumours of wars predictably formed the main content of many a news bulletin, the SOS service carried on, a public service counterpoint and helpmeet, a beacon of continuity.
I think the legacy of the SOS service is an understanding that there are times when the safety of individuals and the welfare of individuals can be handled effectively by a partnership between the emergency services and the BBC.
During Mike Granite's 25 years as a high-ranking civil servant, he served as press secretary to 5 cabinet ministers, including 2 home secretaries. He's an authority on the inner workings of the relationship between the government and the BBC. Mike Granite, the SOS Emergency Service was obviously born in a different communications age to now, but seems to be a good example of voluntary cooperation between the state and the news media.
I think so. I think in the sense that it tunes the BBC system and the government system to understand what the rules should be for these sorts of arrangements. Essentially, government or any official body has to ask for the least that it needs to do the job and give as much information as it can to prove its case. And the BBC, and indeed the other broadcasters, came to the conclusion that what they should do in these circumstances is provide a platform for the talking head from the government or the police, but it should keep its news operations sacrosanct. It should not be part of the editorial arrangements for actually broadcasting news.
We know from our research that the SOS service had its origins in the very earliest days of the BBC. By the time you were working in government, I suppose the service was a well-oiled machine.
Well, I think it was so well-oiled that it really didn't touch government. It was essentially done bilaterally between the police and the BBC. I think it was pretty much like clockwork in the sense that people knew what the rules were. The police had to deliver certain information about circumstances to convince the BBC of their case and the urgency, and the BBC knew exactly what it would ask in terms of information to broadcast. It was very simple, it was very straightforward. But I think the SOS system basically gave a lead to more complex arrangements now, which involve what happens when, for example, a community faces some sort of pollution problem, or there has been a terrorist attack. And in those circumstances, there are now arrangements between the government and official bodies like the police and the BBC and the other broadcasters that allow for a very quick liaison over circumstances in which the public might need information very, very quickly. And where the circumstances are not clear at all. Circumstances of an SOS message were pretty clear. Somebody was dying, you needed to reach their kith and kin. Now we face vastly more complex problems.
But it's the same template, you think?
I think the template of trust, the fact that one needs to be able to prove the case of your government, and the fact that the BBC will stand quite properly on its statutory dignity and say we are an independent broadcasting organisation, independent of government. We must understand what we're going to do is in the public interest. That template is well set.
One of the great things about this programme is it's allowed me to explore not only the history of the SOS message, but this building, which I love. I'm now heading into the inner sanctum itself. This is the Director General's meeting room. Thankfully, he's not here, though I can imagine the 6'6" frame of John Reith striding around this office all those years ago. By the early 1990s, SOS messages were still part of Radio 4's output. And with me is the newsreader and continuity announcer, Alice Arnold. Alice, you remember broadcasting them frequently, don't you?
I do remember them. It wasn't that frequent. It was usually at weekends, in the summer more than any other time, because that's when people were on holiday and they were in their cars. And I would say it was probably only once a fortnight.
As a listener, these messages often affected me, not just curiosity about what happened, but there was a sense of impending human tragedy about a lot of them. And that's just listening to them. You had to read them out. Did they not affect you?
Oh, absolutely they did. I hated doing them. Every time I saw one, I thought that means somebody has a relative who's about to die, and I'm going to announce it to them. And I worried for them. I worried for the reaction that they would have when they were driving the car, because if I heard that, you could do anything. You could swerve off the road or whatever. So I tried to sort of say it very calmly. But I was really aware of what I was telling them. For somebody, that was a tragedy about to happen. And I loathed it.
Can you remember the last one you read? I mean, probably not exactly, but we're trying to pin down when they stopped. Have you got a vague memory as to...
I can remember the studio I was in. But no, was it a bit... Well, mobile phones were what stopped us broadcasting them, I imagine. When everybody had a mobile phone, there was no point in having an SOS message anymore. And so they did fizzle out.
But you don't remember there being a memo and an announcement or...
No, I don't.
We've been able to trace in intricate detail the birth of the SOS message service and how it grew and developed. But the circumstances of its demise are more mysterious and elusive. Previous Radio 4 controllers, network managers, past engineers can't say with certainty how the messages perished. No one even knew they were dangerously ill, and there were no witnesses for their passing into broadcasting history sometime towards the end of the 1990s. We can't make up for the lack of decent send-off, but perhaps this programme might act as some kind of memorial.
The need for them dissolved, and the BBC had lost any sense of where they'd come from in its repertoire.
And yet here is something which could barely be more Reithian. And to have such a long pedigree, to disappear from the airwaves without ceremony, I can't think of anything else that would be allowed to do so. The BBC of all organisations likes to give things a send-off, but this vital part of public service broadcasting for decades
just
vanished.
And nobody said today, this is the last one we're going to do.
As far as we know. Could there ever be a return to an SOS service, do you think? Are there circumstances in which we could see it again?
Yes. For instance, those 2 days in July the 7th and then July the 21st, 2005, The mobile phones were taken down in order to let the emergency services actually communicate properly. It's inconceivable there aren't plans that under some other such incident that you communicate to people by broadcasting, because the conventional communications that we now take for granted would actually disappear for various reasons.
But I think when those mobile phones went down in London, there was a particular response. Here was the piece of technology probably more responsible for the end of SOS messages than anything.
Yes.
It suddenly disappeared, and the instinct was to turn on the radio.
Yes, and you expected that the radio would
tell you what was going on.
Would tell you what was going on. And I've absolutely no doubt, were there to be a big flu epidemic or any other kind of thing that you can think of, then broadcasting would be the place that people would naturally turn.
Well, back in the council chamber, staring up at this portrait of Reith, painted by Sir Oswald Burley in 1933, I'm not sure, is that a disapproving eye as he scans the modern BBC? What is remarkable is that from such a complex, authoritarian and often uncharitable man, his diaries confirm his deep rancour, should come an almost good Samaritan act of helping people in distress through his SOS service.
This is the national programme. Before the news, there is one SOS message. It is for Dibble. Will Mrs. Mary Dibble, last heard of 12 months ago at Crofton Park, Lincoln...
Will Robert David Green, believed to be working in Manchester or Stockport, go at once to Bonchurch Road, Milton, Portsmouth, where his mother, Mrs. Agnes May Green, is dangerously ill.
Will Mr. and Mrs. William Wrigley from Victoria, Australia, at present travelling along the east coast from Scotland to London in a Volkswagen camper van, get in touch with the...
That's the end of the SOS message and of the news.
And now an urgent SOS message was presented by Eddie Mair, who's keen to hear from any listeners who have their own story about the SOS message service. Please do get in touch. You can email Eddie at ipm@bbc.co.uk or write to IPM, room G601, BBC Television Centre, London W12 7RJ. And this programme was produced by Joe Coombs and Stuart Henderson. It's a Loftus production for BBC Radio 4.